She stepped off that stagecoach with one suitcase, no money, and a name that had already arrived before she did. By nightfall, every door in Silver Creek had been slammed in her face. By morning, the whole town was watching to see if the widowed rancher who'd taken her in would come to his senses, or lose everything protecting a woman nobody wanted. What they didn't know was that before winter ended, she would save the life of the very man who hated her most. And that would change every single thing. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the end. You won't regret it. The stagecoach came in 2 hours late and half buried in snow. It lurched through the gap between the livery stable and the general store like something wounded, the horses blowing hard, their coats caked in ice, and the driver hunched so far into his coat that from a distance he looked headless. The wheels cracked over frozen ruts. The whole vehicle shuddered when it finally stopped, and one of the wooden spokes on the rear left wheel had cracked clean through. Nobody noticed it until much later, which was the kind of thing that seemed to happen in Silver Creek. People paid attention to what they wanted to pay attention to. It was late afternoon, though you'd never have guessed it from the sky. The light had that flat gunmetal quality that came in January, when the sun barely bothered to climb above the peaks, before giving up and retreating again. The wind had been coming down off the mountains since morning. Not the howling, violent kind that knocked things over, but the slow, mean kind that found every gap in your clothing and settled in your bones and stayed there. There were maybe a dozen people near the stage stop when it pulled in, not because they were all expecting a delivery, just because Silver Creek was the kind of place where not much happened, and when a stagecoach pulled in during a storm, it was at least something to look at. The driver climbed down first, stiff-legged, swearing under his breath in a way that wasn't quite quiet enough. He pulled the door open with one gloved hand. 3 passengers got out. A cattle buyer from Billings, who everyone recognized. A heavy-set woman visiting her sister on the north end of town. And then last of all, a young woman nobody recognized at all. She was perhaps 24, 25 at most. Not especially tall, not especially small. Dark hair pulled back tight under a hat that had seen better weather. Her coat was decent, wool, not the cheap kind, but it was wet through and had been for a while. She carried one suitcase. Just the one. She set it down on the boardwalk beside her and stood for a moment, looking up at the town the way a person does when they're trying to decide if they've made a mistake. Her name was Evelyn Hart, and her reputation, the ugly, distorted, largely fictional version of it, had arrived in Silver Creek 3 weeks before she did. It had come the way those things usually come in small towns, in pieces, from different directions, none of it traceable back to a single source. A letter passed along between women who belonged to the same church sewing circle, a comment made by a traveling salesman over whiskey at the Rusty Spur Saloon, a conversation between 2 men who had once been in Abilene, where Evelyn had worked for 2 years in the office of a physician named Dr. Charles Whitmore. The story, by the time it reached Silver Creek, had very little to do with the truth. It never does. What people said was this: she had been dismissed from her position in disgrace, that she had behaved inappropriately with a married man, that there had been some kind of scandal involving medication. Nobody was quite sure of the details, but the uncertainty only seemed to make people fill in the blanks with something worse. One version had her stealing. Another had her doing something far less specific but somehow more damning, something people lowered their voices to describe without ever quite describing it. None of it was true. But truth, in January of 1887, had very little currency in Silver Creek. Evelyn picked up her suitcase and walked toward the hotel. The Cassidy House was the only real hotel in town. 2 stories, 8 rooms, a small dining area on the ground floor that served meals 3 times a day and twice on Sundays. It wasn't much, but it was clean and it was warm, and right now warm was the only thing Evelyn cared about. She pushed through the front door. A small bell above it rang. Margaret Cassidy was behind the front desk. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with gray hair pinned severely back and eyes that missed nothing. She looked up when Evelyn came in, and something shifted in her expression, a slight tightening around the mouth, a lowering of the chin, that Evelyn recognized immediately. She'd been seeing that look for 3 weeks, at every stop along the route. "I'd like a room," Evelyn said. She kept her voice even. She'd learned to do that. Margaret Cassidy set down the pen she'd been holding. "We're full." Evelyn looked around the empty lobby. She looked at the keyboard behind Mrs. Cassidy, where at least 5 hooks still held their keys. She looked back at the woman. "I see several keys on that board," she said. "Those rooms are spoken for." "By who?" "That's not your concern." Evelyn stood there for a moment. The cold was coming off her coat in waves. Her fingers were so stiff she could barely feel them around the handle of the suitcase. She took a breath through her nose. "I have money," she said. "I can pay for a week in advance." "I told you, we're full." The bell above the door rang again. Evelyn didn't look back. She was still looking at Margaret Cassidy, trying to find something in the woman's face that wasn't just closed-off contempt, and not finding it. "Ma'am," said the man who'd come in behind her, "it's 20 degrees outside and dropping." Evelyn turned. The man who'd spoken was perhaps 50, barrel-chested, with a deputy's badge on his coat and the kind of face that got weathered by outdoor work until it looked like it was carved from something harder than skin. Deputy Earl Sutton. She'd see his name on the sign outside the marshal's office when the stage rolled through. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to Mrs. Cassidy. "She'll manage," Mrs. Cassidy said flatly. "Her managing ain't exactly what I'm—" "Earl." The voice came from the dining room doorway. Reverend Thomas Blaine stepped through, napkin still in hand, apparently mid-meal. He was a thin man with round spectacles and the permanent expression of someone performing patience for an audience. "Earl, let Mrs. Cassidy run her establishment as she sees fit." Sutton's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Evelyn picked up her suitcase. "Thank you for your time," she said to Margaret Cassidy, and walked back out into the cold. She tried 4 more places. The boarding house on Elk Street, run by a widow named Clara Pruitt, who opened the door 2 inches, looked at Evelyn for exactly 3 seconds, and said, "I don't have any vacancies," and closed it again. The room above the barber shop that old Jonas Webb sometimes rented out. Jonas at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. He scratched the back of his neck and said he thought he'd promised that room to someone. Maybe, he wasn't entirely sure, but probably, and looked at a point somewhere past Evelyn's left shoulder the whole time. The Hendersons, who had a spare room they rented seasonally, according to the notice still posted on the board outside the general store. When Mrs. Henderson came to the door and saw who was asking, she said the notice was out of date, and she was sorry for any confusion, and there was nothing in her voice that sounded sorry at all. And finally, Evelyn stood outside the church hall, because she'd heard they sometimes let people shelter there during bad weather, and the weather was getting significantly worse. The storm that had been building all afternoon was beginning to arrive in earnest. Not the slow, grinding cold from earlier, but something with weight and momentum behind it, snow coming sideways in gusts that stung the face. The church hall door was locked. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the door handle, in the dark, in the snow, and let herself feel it. Just for a moment, just a few seconds. The particular exhaustion that comes not from physical tiredness, but from being refused over and over by people who don't even know you, who only know a story about you that isn't yours. Then she picked up her suitcase again and turned around. She would figure it out. She always figured it out. That was the thing about having been in bad situations before. You knew they didn't kill you, even when they felt like they might. She was still working out exactly what she was going to figure out, when a man's voice said, from somewhere to her left, "You the woman who came in on the afternoon stage?" She almost didn't answer. She was tired of people, frankly. Tired of the way they looked at her, the careful distance they maintained as if whatever she had might be catching. But the voice didn't have that quality, that studied revulsion she'd grown used to. It was just a question, direct and without particular warmth, but also without contempt. She turned. He was standing at the hitching post, in the process of untying a big roan horse that clearly did not want to stand still in the wind. He was tall, not dramatically so, just enough that it registered. Wide through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had been patched at the elbows. His hat was pushed back slightly, which meant snow was landing on his forehead, and he either hadn't noticed or didn't care. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been broken once, years ago, and healed slightly wrong. He was looking at her, not at the story he'd heard about her, just at her. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "You find a place to stay?" "Not yet." He was quiet for a moment, still working the knot on the lead rope. The roan shifted its weight, and he put one hand flat on the horse's neck without looking, just to steady it, and the animal settled a little. "I have room at my ranch," he said. That was it, just that. No explanations, no conditions attached to the front of it, no hedging, just 5 words like he was reporting a fact. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She'd learned to be careful about men who offered things freely. She'd learned it the hard way, working in Whitmore's office, where nothing was ever quite as uncomplicated as it looked. "Why?" she said. He looked faintly surprised. Not offended, just surprised, like he hadn't expected the question. He thought about it honestly, which was itself unusual. "Because it's 20 degrees and you've got 1 suitcase," he said. "And because I've got 3 empty bedrooms and a son who hasn't had a decent meal made for him since October." "I'm not a cook," she said. "I have medical training." "I know what you have. Margaret Cassidy's got a mouth on her." He finally freed the lead rope and gathered it in one hand. "You coming or not? I've got a 40-minute ride back to the ranch, and I'd rather do it now before the storm gets properly bad." Evelyn looked up the dark, empty street. The snow was coming harder. Every window she could see had lamplight in it, warm yellow light, the kind that meant people inside who'd chosen to stay inside, who'd closed their doors and meant it. She picked up her suitcase. "I'm coming," she said. His name, he told her as they rode out of town, was Rhett Callahan. He ran a cattle operation about 6 miles north of Silver Creek, up against the base of the mountains. He'd been running it alone for 4 years now, since his wife died. He said all of this without any particular emotion, just laying out information, and Evelyn didn't push on any of it. She was too cold to push on anything. She sat in the saddle behind him. The ranch's second horse, a gray mare, was apparently at home with a thrown shoe, with her suitcase balanced across her knees and her face ducked against the wind, and concentrated on staying on the horse. The mountains were invisible in the dark and the snow. She could feel them somehow anyway. Some quality of the silence behind the wind, a sense of scale and mass. She'd grown up in Pennsylvania, where the land was gentle and crowded and nothing was very far from anything else. This was different. This was the kind of country that didn't particularly care whether you were there or not. "What's your son's name?" she asked, mainly to have something to say. "Owen," Rhett said. He paused. "He's 7, he's quiet, he won't give you any trouble." 7-year-olds always give you trouble. He glanced back at her. "You have experience with children?" "I have a younger brother. I helped raise him for 3 years after our mother got sick." Rhett said nothing to that, just turned forward again and kept riding. The ranch came out of the dark after what felt like longer than 40 minutes, but was probably right on it. A gate, a long fence line appearing in the lamplight from the house, a yard that was mostly mud-frozen solid under a 1/4 inch of new snow. The house itself was larger than she'd expected, a proper 2-story structure, not a cabin, built from heavy timber with a covered porch running the full length of the front. It had the look of something built by someone who'd meant it to last, and then been maintained by someone who'd lost interest in keeping it up. The porch boards were warped. One of the shutters on the second floor hung at an angle. A length of fence on the near side of the yard had been repaired with different colored wood, probably in a hurry. A working ranch. A struggling one, maybe. Not desperate, but stretched. Rhett took the horse around to the barn. Evelyn climbed down and stood in the yard, holding her suitcase, looking at the house. A curtain moved in the front window. Someone had been watching for them. She thought of the boy, Owen, 7 years old and quiet. The front door opened before she reached it. The boy standing in the doorway was small for 7, with dark eyes like his father's and hair that needed cutting badly. He was holding a lantern in both hands in the careful, practiced way of a child who'd been trusted with fire because there was no one else to carry it. He looked at Evelyn with open, serious assessment, the way small children look at people when they haven't learned yet to hide what they're thinking. "You're the lady from town," he said. "I am," Evelyn said. "Pa said you might be staying for a while." "That seems to be the plan." Owen stepped back from the doorway to let her in. It wasn't quite a welcome, so it was more careful than that, but it wasn't suspicion either. It was just the pragmatic courtesy of a child who understood that people came and went in a house like this, and that you dealt with each one as they came. Evelyn stepped inside. The house was warm, at least. A wood stove burning in the main room, the heat a physical shock after the cold. It was also profoundly untidy, in the way of a household that had been managed by someone who didn't have enough hours in the day and had learned to prioritize survival over neatness. Dishes in the dry sink waiting to be washed, a coat draped over the back of a chair, a pair of boots by the door that had been placed there and then half kicked out of the way and never moved again, a stack of papers on the table that might have been bills or livestock records or both. None of it was filthy, just lived in past the point of comfort, the way houses get when they're being run on not quite enough of everything. "There's a room upstairs," Owen said. He was still watching her with those serious eyes. "Second door on the left. Pa said to show you." "Thank you," Evelyn said. She followed him up the stairs, suitcase in hand. The room he showed her was small. A bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the back of the property toward the barn. The bed had clean sheets on it, which surprised her. Someone had made an effort, recently, from the look of it, because they weren't dusty. Rhett Callahan had made up the room before he came to town. She thought about that for a long moment. The fire, the clean sheets, these were deliberate preparations made before he'd even known if she'd accept. He'd come into town with the intention of offering, had anticipated that she might say yes, and had made ready for her. She set her suitcase at the foot of the bed and sat down on the mattress. Outside the window, the storm was properly arrived now. Snow driving sideways past the glass, the wind making a low, sustained sound in the rafters. It was the kind of night she'd have been in real trouble on, without this. She should have felt relief. She felt something more complicated than relief. She felt the particular wariness that comes from having been helped and not yet understanding the cost. Because in her experience, everything had a cost, and the ones you didn't see coming were always the worst. But she was also exhausted and cold and 24 years old, and she had been refused by 5 separate people in the same afternoon. And sometimes you just had to let yourself be somewhere warm and deal with the rest of it tomorrow. She heard Rhett come in from the barn below, heard him pull off his boots, heard him say something quiet to Owen that she couldn't make out, heard the boy's voice reply. A couple words, nothing she could parse. Then it was just the storm and the creak of the house settling into the cold, and Evelyn Hart sitting on the edge of a bed in a house she'd never been in before, in a town that didn't want her, trying to figure out what kind of person would do what Rhett Callahan had just done. Morning came gray and quiet. The storm had spent itself overnight and left behind one of those peculiar winter silences. The snow muffled everything, deadened it, made the world feel smaller and more contained. Evelyn woke before dawn, as she generally did, a habit from her years in Whitmore's office when the first patient sometimes arrived before breakfast. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself. The room, the ranch, Silver Creek. Then she got up, washed her face with water from the pitcher on the washstand, ice cold because the night had been hard, and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty. Through the window she could see tracks in the snow leading to the barn. Rhett, already working, hours before first light. She found the stove and built it up from the coals that were still smoldering at the bottom, found coffee in a pot, found flour and salt and lard, and by the time she heard Boots on the porch, she had coffee made and a batch of biscuits in the oven and had discovered that the bacon hung in the pantry was only half frozen, which she considered a victory. Rhett stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the stove, looked at the counter, looked at her, in the way of someone recalibrating something. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Is there anything in this house that doesn't need mending? I was going to offer to go through the supply closet today. Medicines, bandages, whatever you have. There's a box under the stairs. Haven't touched it since—" He stopped. "Since a while. I'll take a look." He came in and poured himself a coffee. Owen appeared at the bottom of the stairs a few minutes later, still pulling on his boot, one-handed, with the automatic stubbornness of a child who will not ask for help. He looked at the kitchen counter and then at his father. "She made biscuits," he said. "I can see that. They smell good." "They do." Owen sat down at the table and finished with his boot in silence. Then he folded his hands in his lap and looked at Evelyn with that measured, serious expression. "I can set the table if you want," he said. Not offering exactly, more like stating that he was capable of it, in case that was useful information. "I'd appreciate that," Evelyn said. He nodded and got up and started getting plates. There was something about the way they moved around each other, father and son in this kitchen, that told her everything about what 4 years of managing alone looked like. Every action was efficient, automatic, stripped of anything that wasn't necessary. They knew where things were. They knew what the other one would do. There was no warmth missing exactly, just a great deal of compression. Grief and loneliness and work and routine compressed down into a functional unit that got through the days. She was an intrusion into that. She knew it. She didn't think it was a bad thing, necessarily. Sometimes intrusions were what opened things up again. But she knew she was one. They ate breakfast mostly in silence. The biscuits were good. She could tell from the way Owen ate 3 of them and tried not to look like he was noticing how good they were. After breakfast, Rhett told her plainly. She had a room for as long as she needed one. He wasn't expecting anything in return. If she wanted to help with the household to earn her keep, he wouldn't argue against it. If she wanted to ride into town and look for work, he'd take her in when he made his supply runs. "The town won't hire me," she said. "Not at first," he agreed. He was looking at his coffee cup. "People around here aren't—" He paused, chose a different word. "They make up their minds fast. Takes longer to unmake them." "Do you know what they're saying about me?" He looked up at her then, direct. "I know what Margaret Cassidy told half the town," he said. "I know what Earl Sutton's been repeating at the saloon, and I know that Margaret Cassidy hasn't told the truth about anything in 15 years, and Earl Sutton has the judgment of a wet boot." He set his cup down. "So no, I don't put much stock in it." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "You don't even know if it's true," she said. Not accusatory, just honest. "What they're saying?" "No," he agreed. "Doesn't that bother you?" Rhett was quiet for a few seconds. Outside, a horse in the paddock made a sound, and he glanced automatically toward the window, an old reflex. "Bothered me enough that I asked myself about it," he said finally. "But you got off that stage in a storm with one bag and no place to go and asked for a room same as anybody would. People refusing you told me more about them than about you." It was not a speech. It was just what he thought, said plainly, without any decoration. Evelyn looked down at her plate. "I was accused of stealing medication from a doctor's office," she said. "That's the true version of what happened. What actually happened was that I noticed the doctor was administering incorrect dosages to several patients, elderly ones mostly, because he hadn't updated his knowledge in 20 years, and he was too proud to admit it. I kept records. I raised it with him privately first. When he didn't act, I took my concerns to the county medical board." She paused. The kitchen was very quiet. "He had friends on that board," she said. "I lost my position. He fabricated a reason. By the time I'd packed my things, the story had already changed into something I didn't recognize." She looked up at Rhett. He was watching her, not with the skeptical expression she expected, the careful calculation of a man deciding whether to believe her, just listening. "You don't have to believe me either," she said. "I didn't say I didn't." Owen, who had been sitting very still during this exchange with the particular stillness of a child pretending to be invisible, picked up his plate and carried it to the dry sink without being asked. The first week was careful. That was the only word for it. Careful. Everyone moving around the edges of a new situation, testing what it was, what it would hold. Evelyn spent the days going through the house systematically, not reorganizing it, because it wasn't hers to reorganize, but addressing the specific places where the neglect had started becoming a problem. A tear in Owen's winter coat, large enough that cold air came through. The supply box under the stairs, which held a collection of medical provisions that had been bought at some point with good intentions, and then never sorted. Bandages, a bottle of carbolic, some dried herbs, a packet of something labeled in handwriting she couldn't read. She sorted it, restocked what was missing with things Rhett brought back from his supply run, made a list of what else they'd need before spring. She was careful about Owen. He was a child who'd learned to get along without very much, and there was a particular kind of pride in that, a small person dignity that she didn't want to trample. She didn't make a fuss over him, didn't ask him excessive questions, just treated him matter-of-factly, included him in tasks without making a performance of it, and let him come to her at whatever speed he chose. He chose, after 3 days, to ask her what her bag of instruments was for. She showed him. He was fascinated, in the serious, thorough way of a child who gets interested in something and wants to understand it properly, rather than just know the surface of it. She explained what each tool did. He asked questions. She answered them without talking down to him. That was, she reflected, probably the beginning of it. The town was a different matter. Rhett's supply runs to Silver Creek happened twice a week, and sometimes she rode in with him because she needed to handle her own affairs and because she refused to behave like someone in hiding. Every time she did, she felt the looks following her down the main street. The deliberate not meeting of eyes that was worse than hostility somehow, because it took effort. Margaret Cassidy's hotel was directly across from the general store, and Margaret Cassidy apparently had nothing better to do on those days than stand in her front window and watch. Clara Pruitt, the boarding house woman, stopped her once on the street, quite deliberately stepped into her path, and said with a smile that didn't reach anything above the mouth, "Miss Hart, still in town, I see." "Still in the territory," Evelyn agreed pleasantly. "Rhett Callahan is a good man," Clara said. The implication was clear. A good man who is making a very poor decision. "He is," Evelyn said, and walked around her. But there was also, that second week, a moment she hadn't expected. She was at the general store making a purchase. Thread, she needed thread. The state of the mending at Callahan Ridge was a separate emergency. And a woman was there with a small girl of about 3 who had something going on with her eyes, both of them swollen and seeping. The woman was talking to the storekeeper in a low, worried voice, and the storekeeper was shrugging in the helpless way of men who don't know what to do. Evelyn didn't think about it. She just walked over. "Excuse me," she said to the mother. "I have some training in medicine. May I look?" The woman's name was Addie Marsh, and she was too worried about her daughter to care about whatever stories she'd heard. She let Evelyn look. Evelyn asked several questions, looked carefully at the child's eyes, asked about other symptoms. "It's conjunctivitis," she said. "Not serious, though. I know it looks frightening. You'll want to clean the eyes gently with warm water several times a day. Don't let her rub them. And keep her away from other children for a week or so. It passes easily." She gave the woman a few more specific instructions. Addie Marsh listened carefully, nodded, looked at her daughter, looked back at Evelyn. "Thank you," she said quietly, not effusively, just with the sincerity of a mother whose immediate problem had just gotten smaller. "Of course," Evelyn said. She felt someone watching and looked up. The storekeeper, Tom Birch, was looking at her from behind his counter with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not the closed-off contempt she'd gotten used to, but something more unsettled, like he was recalculating something and wasn't comfortable with the result. She bought her thread and left. The night Owen couldn't breathe was the night everything shifted. She heard him from her room. It was close to 2 a.m, the dead hour, when even winter seems to hold still for a moment. She'd been asleep, genuinely asleep, not just lying in the dark, which was itself progress. And the sound pulled her up out of it fast and sharp, the way you come up from sleep when you're trained to listen. She was in the hallway before she was fully awake, moving by instinct. And the sound was coming from Owen's room. A wrong sound, a sound with effort in it, like breathing through something. She pushed his door open. He was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, and his chest was moving all wrong. Short, fast, high-up heaves that weren't getting air down where it needed to go. His face was pale in the lamplight from the hallway. He was trying not to panic, she could see that, trying to be the kind of child who managed things, but the panic was in his eyes. "Okay," she said, and she kept her voice calm the way she'd been trained to keep it calm. Because a calm voice in a frightened room is itself a kind of medicine. "I need you to sit up straight for me." "Good. Now I'm going to put my hand on your back, and I need you to try to breathe slow. Don't fight it, just slow. Can you do that?" He nodded. Couldn't speak. She sat beside him and put one hand between his shoulder blades and the other on his chest and felt what was happening. The tightness, the resistance, the way his small body was working against itself. Rhett appeared in the doorway, barefoot, hair disordered, and she looked at him over her shoulder. "Steam," she said. "Boil water as much as you can and bring it in a basin. Fast." He went without a word. She stayed with Owen, keeping her hand on his back, talking to him in a low, continuous voice. Not about anything, just talk, just sound, something to anchor him. His breathing was alarming, but not, she assessed, immediately dangerous. This had the character of a spasm, something that had likely happened before. Bronchial, brought on probably by the cold or something he'd breathed in the day before. "Has this happened before?" she asked, keeping her voice even, conversational. He managed a nod. "What did your father do before?" A pause for breath. Sat with me, Owen said, just barely. Smart man. When Rhett came back with the basin, she had him set it on the floor, and she had Owen lean over it with a blanket over his head, breathing the steam. She talked him through it, kept monitoring, watched his face for color and his chest for changes. After 20 minutes, the tight, frantic quality of his breathing had softened. After 40 minutes, he was breathing something approaching normally, though he was exhausted. He lay back down. She checked him once more, pulled the covers up. You'll probably be tired tomorrow, she said. That's normal. Stay warm. He looked at her. His eyes were sleepy now, the fear drained off. Thank you, he said. Very quiet. Sleep, she said. In the hallway, Rhett was waiting. He'd been there the whole time, visible through the doorway, close enough to be present, but back enough not to crowd the room. His face was controlled. The particular control of a parent who has been frightened and won't let himself show the full extent of it, because that seems somehow like it would make it worse. It's his lungs? She said, keeping her voice low. Since he was 3, Rhett said. He was looking at the floor. Doc Morrison in town says there's nothing to be done, that he'll likely grow out of it. He might, she said honestly. Some children do, but there are things you can do in the meantime. I want to go through what's in his room, see if there's anything that makes it worse, dust, certain kinds of wood in the fire. And there are measures to take at the first sign of it coming on, earlier than tonight. Rhett looked up at her. He had the look of a man who had been managing a frightening thing alone for a long time, and has just been told by someone who seems to know what they're doing that the thing can be partially managed. It was a complicated look. Gratitude, certainly, but also the complicated relief of realizing you've been carrying weight you didn't have to carry quite so entirely alone. All right, he said, quietly. They stood in the hallway for a moment. You should sleep, Evelyn said. Yeah, he said, and then didn't move for another few seconds. Then, thank you, Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her name. She noted that. She wasn't sure what it meant exactly, only that something had moved, imperceptibly but definitely, like a door that hasn't opened yet but has come unlatched. She went back to her room. Outside, the Montana winter was still enormous and indifferent and vast. But inside Callahan Ridge Ranch, something had shifted in the small, quiet way that real things shift. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a change in weight, a change in what was leaning against what. It would be a while before anyone recognized what it was, but it had begun. The following weeks moved with a strange, doubling quality. Inside the ranch, something warming and tentative. Outside it, something that was building pressure in the opposite direction. In town, the whispers had not quieted. If anything, the fact of Evelyn's continued presence at Callahan Ridge had given them a new direction to move in. What had started as a story about her character had become, with the creative efficiency of small-town gossip, a story about Rhett's judgment, about what it meant that he was harboring her, about what exactly was going on out there at that ranch. She heard it third hand from Rhett, who heard it firsthand and wouldn't have told her except that she needed to know. Tom Birch at the general store had been the one to raise it, directly, to Rhett's face, on a morning when Rhett had gone in alone for supplies. People are talking, Rhett, Tom had said, about what it looks like. What does it look like? Rhett had asked, in the mild voice he used when he was more irritated than he wanted to show. A woman, unchaperoned, living on your property. You a widower. You know how people take that. I know how small-minded people take it, Rhett had said, and picked up his supplies and left. He told Evelyn this in the kitchen, without editorializing, just laying out the information. She listened. You understand that I'm costing you, she said. It wasn't a question. You're not costing me anything I care about, he said. Your reputation in this town has never paid my mortgage or fed my son, he said. And frankly, if my reputation in this town depends on turning a woman out into a blizzard, then it was worth considerably less than I thought. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. You're more stubborn than you look, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Most people figure that out eventually. But she knew the pressure was real. She could feel it each time they rode into town. The way it had a specific, organized quality, not just the vague social discomfort of before, but something more purposeful, more coordinated. And at the center of it, though she couldn't always see him directly, was Marshall Grant Holloway. She'd met Holloway once, briefly, outside the marshal's office, in the second week. He was a solid, middle-aged man with a lawman's flat face and the kind of confidence that came from years of people stepping out of his way. He'd looked at her with no particular expression and said, "Miss Hart," in the way of someone acknowledging a known quantity they'd already made a judgment about. She had said, "Marshal," back, equally flat. He was the one, Rhett told her, who had first circulated the story to the men who mattered in Silver Creek, to the town council, to the business owners, to the men who set the social weather of the place. He had connections back east, Holloway did, or claimed to. Had apparently known someone who knew someone who had been in Abilene. She didn't know exactly what he'd said. She knew the effect of it. But inside Callahan Ridge, things continued their own quiet evolution. Owen had warmed to her completely now, in the reserved, thorough way he did everything. Not with effusion, but with the kind of steady, reliable openness that was, she thought, perhaps the most genuine kind. He showed her things. The litter of kittens in the barn. The particular tree at the far edge of the yard that he'd been trying to climb since fall and was finally close to managing. The leather-bound book he kept with drawings in it. Not quite art, not quite writing, just marks and shapes and observations in a child's careful hand. She showed him things in return. How to properly clean and bandage a wound. The correct way to read a fever. The names of instruments and what they did. It wasn't what she'd planned for her life. She hadn't planned for any of this. But there was something here that felt cautiously like the beginning of something that mattered, and she was too worn down and too honest with herself to pretend she didn't feel it. Spring was still months away. There was a great deal of winter left to survive. But Evelyn Hart was still here, and that, she was beginning to think, counted for something. February arrived the way February always did in Montana, without apology. The cold settled deeper into the ground, into the walls of the house, into everything that hadn't been properly insulated against it, which in the case of Callahan Ridge Ranch was quite a lot. Evelyn spent the better part of the first week of the month locating every draft and addressing it with whatever she could find. Rags, strips of old canvas, wood shims she'd watched Rhett cut and learned to cut herself when he didn't have time. She worked methodically, room by room, with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned that comfort wasn't given to you but constructed, slowly, out of whatever materials were available. Rhett watched her do this without comment for 3 days. Then on the 4th day, he came in from the barn to find her on a chair reaching up to stuff a rag into the gap where the kitchen window frame had pulled away from the wall, and he said, "I've been meaning to fix that." "I know," she said, without turning around. A pause. "It's a 2-person job, properly." "Then hand me that strip of canvas." He handed it to her. They fixed the window together without discussing it further. That was how things generally happened at the ranch now. Not planned, not announced, just arrived at through the practical logic of 2 people occupying the same space and addressing the same problems. Owen had stopped treating her like a guest somewhere around the middle of January. She couldn't have named the exact moment. It had just gradually become the case that he came to find her when something happened. A small cut on his hand from the barn, a question about the drawing he was working on, a complaint about the arithmetic problem his father had assigned him that morning. He didn't come with the easy, unself-conscious confidence of a child with a present mother, but with something more cautious and considered, more chosen, which she thought might actually mean more. One morning, she found him at the kitchen table before she was fully awake, the leather drawing book open, working on something with a short pencil he held very close to the page. She poured herself a coffee and sat across from him and didn't say anything. After a few minutes, he turned the book around and slid it across the table to her. It was a drawing of the ranch, the house, the barn, the fence line, the mountains behind. And in the yard, 2 figures, one tall, one shorter, standing next to each other. The tall one had long hair. The shorter one was wearing what she recognized, after a moment, as the coat Owen always wore. The brown one she'd repaired the tear in back in January. She looked at the drawing for a moment. "That's good," she said. "You got the proportions right on the barn." Owen pulled the book back. "I know the barn the best," he said seriously. "I've drawn it the most." It was a small thing. She didn't make a production of it, but she thought about it later, turning it over quietly in her mind. And what she came back to was the simple fact that he'd drawn her there, in the yard, as if she belonged. She wasn't sure how to hold that. It was a light thing, but it had weight in it. The town, meanwhile, was working itself up towards something. She felt it on the supply run in the second week of February, a quality to the looks she got that was more organized than before, less casual. People moved out of her path, not with the spontaneous awkwardness of social discomfort, but with the deliberate efficiency of people who have made a decision. A woman she didn't know crossed the street to avoid sharing the boardwalk with her. Two men outside the saloon stopped talking when she passed and stood in a specific arrangement, not quite blocking but not blocking either, until she'd gone far enough to suit them. She went into the general store. Tom Birch was behind the counter, and he had the careful neutrality of a man trying to appear uninvolved in something he was actually very involved in. She put her list on the counter. He looked at it without picking it up. "I heard you're still out at Callahan's," he said. "I am," she said. "Some folks are thinking that's not a good situation." "Some folks," she said, "have been wrong about most things they've thought about me so far." Tom Birch's mouth tightened. He picked up the list. She waited. He filled the order. Not cheerfully, not with any of the automatic social warmth that passed between people in shops, but he filled it, which was, she'd learned, about as much as she could expect right now. She paid, gathered her supplies, and was almost to the door when she heard the bell above it ring and nearly walked directly into Marshall Grant Holloway. He stopped. She stopped. He was in his full official coat, the one with the badge visible. She'd noticed before that he wore the badge more conspicuously on days when he was likely to encounter her, and she didn't think that was accidental. "Miss Hart," he said. "Marshall." He didn't step aside, not quite blocking the door, but occupying it in a way that required her to either ask him to move or wait, and she suspected he'd calculated this. "I was meaning to have a word with you," he said. "Have it," she said. Something flickered across his face. He'd expected her to flinch, or step back, or do something smaller. She was past doing small things for the convenience of people who didn't wish her well. "There are concerns," he said, "about your presence in this community, about what it implies for the families of this town that a woman of your background, my background," she said, "which you've described to everyone you could find without, as far as I can tell, having any actual knowledge of it." His face went carefully still. "I know what I was told." "By whom?" "That's not something I'm prepared to share." "Then we don't have anything very useful to talk about, do we, Marshall?" She shifted the supplies in her arms. "If you have a specific legal concern about my presence in Silver Creek, I'd be happy to address it. If this is a social opinion, I'm afraid I can't help you with it." She waited. He stood in the doorway. Outside, she was aware that a few people on the street had slowed down, watching. Holloway stepped aside. She went out into the cold. Her hands were not quite steady until she'd turned the corner, and she was angry at that. The trembling that came from adrenaline that made it look like fear when it wasn't. She stopped and stood still for a moment, out of sight of the main street, and breathed the cold air and let her hands settle. She wasn't afraid of Grant Holloway. She was angry at the fundamental waste of it, the energy spent defending her existence in a place to men who had already decided about her, the tedium of being someone else's ongoing project of contempt. She walked back to where Rhett had tied the horses. He was there before her, came around the corner of the feed store just as she arrived, carrying a sack of grain. He looked at her face and said nothing immediately, just loaded the grain, then looked at her again. "Holloway," she said. It wasn't a question. "I heard," he said. "Tom Birch's boy was watching from the window. Word travels fast in this town." "It does." He was quiet for a moment, checking the straps on the saddlebag. "What'd he say to you?" "The usual arrangement of words that means he'd like me gone." "Did he threaten you?" "Nothing specific enough to be actionable." She paused. "He's building toward something, though. Whatever he's doing, it's becoming more organized." Rhett tied off the strap. He wasn't looking at her, but she could see the set of his jaw, the particular tension that appeared there when he was thinking hard about something he intended to do something about. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't go talk to him," she said. "Not now. It'll make it worse. It'll look like you're defending me, which will confirm everything they're already assuming." "I am defending you." "I know." She held his gaze. "But there's a way to do it that doesn't give them more ammunition, and there's a way that does. Please." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." They rode back to the ranch mostly in silence. The mountains were clear today, sharp-edged against a sky so blue it almost hurt. The kind of beautiful that felt insulting when you were irritated about something. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said when they were about halfway back. "Go ahead." "Your wife." She paused, not sure if she was crossing a line. "What was she like?" He didn't answer immediately. She had a moment of thinking she'd misstepped, but then he spoke. "Capable," he said. "Funny, when she wanted to be. Better with horses than me, though she'd deny it if she thought I was listening." He was looking at the road. "She was sick for a long time before she died. Owen was 3. She spent most of that year trying to make sure he'd be all right without her." He stopped there. "She sounds like someone who got things done," Evelyn said. "That's about right." He was quiet another moment. "She would have liked you," he said. "She didn't have much patience for people who backed down." Evelyn didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it, just nodded and looked at the road ahead. The week after the confrontation with Holloway, 3 things happened in close enough succession that Evelyn would later think of them as a kind of shift in the story's weather, the way pressure changes before a storm. The first was that Addie Marsh came out to the ranch. She arrived in the morning on her own small wagon, her daughter Lucy sitting beside her, eyes clear now, the conjunctivitis resolved weeks ago. Evelyn came out onto the porch when she heard the wagon. "I hope I'm not intruding," Addie said. She was a woman of perhaps 30, with the competent, slightly worn look of a farm wife, the kind of person who had more demands on her time than hours in the day to meet them. "I wanted to bring you something." She held out a covered pot. "Beef soup. It keeps well. I figured with the cold—" "Thank you," Evelyn said, and meant it. Addie climbed down. Lucy stayed on the wagon seat, watching Evelyn with the straightforward curiosity of a small child. Addie glanced back at her and then at Evelyn. "Lucy's been asking about you," she said. "She says you made her eyes stop hurting." "The warm water mostly did that," Evelyn said. "She says you explained it to her. What was wrong? And why?" Addie paused. "She's 4. Nobody explains things to her." There was something in that sentence that was larger than the sentence itself. Evelyn received it. "Would you like to come in?" she said. "I have coffee." Addie looked uncertain for a moment. She'd clearly not planned to stay, had planned to deliver the soup and leave, the transaction neat and contained. Then she said, "Just for a few minutes," and tied off the horse. They sat in the kitchen. Owen appeared at the top of the stairs, clocked the visitor, and came down with his usual deliberate caution, looking Lucy over with the careful assessment of a child who doesn't know yet whether another child is going to be interesting or not. Lucy looked back at him with complete equanimity. Owen went to get his drawing book. Within 10 minutes, they were at the other end of the table, Owen showing Lucy his drawings of the ranch animals with the solemn air of a curator. Addie watched them. "He's a good boy," she said. "He is," Evelyn agreed. "I heard about his breathing spell a few weeks ago. Word got around." Addie turned her cup in her hands. "I heard it was bad. It was manageable. Margaret Cassidy says it would have been fine without you." "Margaret Cassidy wasn't there," Evelyn said, without heat. Addie nodded slowly. "No," she said. "She wasn't." She looked at Evelyn directly. "I don't know what the truth is about whatever happened before you came here. I want to say that straight out. But I know what I saw outside Birch's store, and I know what I see right now, and I can form my own opinion from that." "That's all I can ask," Evelyn said. Addie left after an hour. She took Lucy, who had to be gently detached from Owen's drawing book, and she drove back toward town. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the wagon go. The second thing that happened was that Rhett fell. It was a small fall. He'd tell her afterward that it was nothing, that ranchers fell from heights twice that and walked away. But it happened at the wrong angle, and he came into the house that evening moving carefully with one arm held close to his side. "Let me look at that," she said. "It's fine." "Rhett." He let her look. 2 ribs, possibly cracked, definitely bruised. She wrapped them, told him how to manage it, told him what to watch for. He sat at the kitchen table through the whole thing with the stoic patience of a man who found the experience of being tended to somewhat foreign and was not entirely sure what to do with it. "You're going to need to let Owen do more for the next 2 weeks," she said, "and I can take over the morning feeding." "You don't know that—" "Then show me," she said. Tomorrow morning, show me the routine. He looked at her. His face was doing the thing it did sometimes. That calculation, that weighing, the look of a man deciding whether to let someone help him with something. All right, he said. She learned the morning routine. It was not simple. There were specific animals with specific requirements. A sequence to the feeding that had its own logic she had to learn from scratch. She made mistakes the first 2 days. One of the horses she fed in the wrong order, which apparently mattered, and it showed its opinion of this by being obstinate about coming in from the paddock. Rhett, watching from the fence with his ribs wrapped under his coat, told her what she'd done wrong without making a performance of it. She fixed it the next day. On the 4th morning, she got through the whole routine in the right sequence, with no complications, and she was coming out of the barn when she saw Rhett at the fence, and he had the look of someone trying not to show that they're pleased. "Better," he said. "Don't sound so surprised," she said, pulling off her gloves. Something crossed his face that was the closest she'd seen him come to an actual smile. "I'm not surprised," he said. It was the third thing that unraveled some of what the first two had built. It started with a letter. It arrived on a Thursday, brought by the stage along with the regular mail, and Evelyn knew from the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it that it was from Dr. Whitmore himself, or from someone writing on his behalf, which was worse. She opened it at the kitchen table, alone, while Rhett was in the barn and Owen was working on his arithmetic upstairs. It was from Whitmore's lawyer. The letter was formal and precise in the way that legal correspondence is designed to be. No direct threats, nothing that could be called threatening by any careful reading, just a series of statements about Evelyn's conduct in Abilene and the damage to Dr. Whitmore's reputation, and a suggestion that she cease any attempt to practice medicine outside of licensed medical facilities, which she was not doing, had not done, could not be accused of doing in any documented sense. It was, she understood, a warning. Not about law, about reach, about the fact that Charles Whitmore had not forgotten about her and had resources she did not have. She sat with the letter for a while. Then she folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, where she kept things she needed to deal with eventually and couldn't deal with right now. She went out to help with the afternoon chores. Rhett noticed something was off. She could tell he noticed because he watched her in that peripheral way he had, not staring, just aware, the way you're aware of weather. He didn't ask until after Owen had gone to bed, when they were both in the kitchen, her mending by the lamp, him doing the account book he always put off as long as possible, and then did with the expression of a man completing a sentence. "Bad news?" he said, not looking up from the book. She considered lying, or not lying exactly, just deflecting, keeping it contained, which was her habit, which had been her habit for a long time because her problems were hers to manage, and she'd never had someone to hand them to. She took the letter out and put it on the table between them. He read it. Slowly, thoroughly, the way he read everything. Then he set it down. "Whitmore," she said, "I read the name. It's not a legal action. It's intimidation," he said flatly. His voice hadn't changed volume, but there was something in it now, a specific quality she hadn't heard before. "He wants you scared and quiet." "He wants me gone," she said, "preferably somewhere he doesn't have to think about me." "Are you going to be?" She looked at him. Gone? Scared? She thought about it honestly, because it was an honest question. "I'm not scared," she said. "He has money and connections, and I have," she gestured vaguely, "what I have." "Which is what?" She looked at him. "The truth," she said, a bit dryly, "and apparently a room at a cattle ranch in the middle of Montana." Rhett picked up the letter, folded it, and handed it back to her. Then he looked at her with a directness that was characteristic of him and also still, in some unguarded part of herself, startling. "You're not dealing with him alone," he said. "Rhett, I'm not saying I have answers tonight. I'm saying you're not dealing with him alone." He looked back at the account book. "We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out." Such a simple construction. Subject, verb, object. The simplest possible expression of something not being a solitary problem anymore. She looked at the lamp for a moment, at the way the light moved in the draft from the window they'd fixed together, and felt something move in her that she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, or not only that. Something older and more necessary than gratitude. The specific relief of not being the only person who knows something difficult. February ended without resolution. That was true of most things in a Montana winter. They didn't resolve, they just continued until the conditions changed. The pressure from town continued. The letters from Whitmore's lawyer did not come again, but their absence felt provisional, like a pause rather than an ending. Inside the ranch, the days moved with their own rhythm. She learned more of the ranch's requirements. She kept working through the supply box, ordering things from the medical supply catalog that Birch's store could occasionally get in from the city, building towards something that wasn't quite a medical practice, but wasn't not one either. It was more a preparedness, a set of tools and knowledge available if needed. She was needed twice more before the end of February. A ranch hand named Pete, who worked the neighboring property and had ridden over to borrow a tool, had a hand wound that was a week old and headed toward infection. She cleaned it properly, which was not comfortable for Pete, who bore it with the particular rigid stoicism of a young man who would rather suffer than appear to be suffering. She wrapped it, told him to come back in 3 days, told him to stop wrapping it in the barn rag he'd apparently been using as a bandage. "What's wrong with the barn rag?" he said. "Everything," she said. 3 days, Pete." He came back in 3 days. The hand was better. He didn't say much, but he came back, and that was its own kind of communication. The second time was a woman she didn't know, who arrived at the ranch gate on a pale horse in the late afternoon and asked, with careful dignity, if the woman who'd helped Addie Marsh's daughter was still staying here. Her name was Ruth Colton. She had a child at home with a fever that had gone on too long, and she'd exhausted what she knew to do. Evelyn rode back with her, spent an hour at the Colton homestead, assessed the child. High fever, but not dangerously so. The lungs clear, probably viral. Nothing to do but manage it and wait. She showed Ruth what to watch for, how to bring the fever down safely, what would tell her if it was getting worse. Ruth Colton watched her with a quality of attention that was very close to the attention Addie Marsh had given her in the kitchen, the careful attention of a person who's been managing something frightening alone and has found something useful. "Thank you," Ruth said when Evelyn was getting ready to leave. "Of course." "I heard things," Ruth said. "Just that. Plain. In town. About you." Evelyn waited. "I don't put as much stock in things I hear as I used to," Ruth said. "Not after my husband, when he—" She stopped. "Anyway, thank you." Evelyn rode back to the ranch in the last light, the mountains going purple ahead of her, the air still and very cold. She thought about Ruth Colton saying that, about Addie Marsh sitting in the kitchen, about Pete coming back in 3 days. None of it solved anything. The town's organizing sentiment was still there, still being directed, still finding its shape. Grant Holloway was still watching. Whitmore's letter was still folded in her coat pocket. The fundamental situation had not changed. But something else was also true, and she could feel it accumulating the way snow accumulates. No single flake of any consequence, but something happening nonetheless. She unsaddled the horse and brushed him down and came out of the barn into the cold yard, and the lights in the ranch house were lit against the dark, warm yellow squares in the black, and she stood for a moment looking at them. The thing she'd felt looking at Owen's drawing, the weight in it, the lightness too, was back. Standing here with cold hands and her breath making shapes in the dark air, looking at a house where people were waiting for her to come in. She was not naive enough to think it meant she was safe, but she was honest enough to admit that for the first time since Abilene, she did not feel entirely alone, and that in February in Montana was not a small thing. She went inside. March came in hard, not the theatrical violence of a January blizzard. Those storms announced themselves, built for hours, gave you time to prepare. March in the Montana high country did something different and meaner. It waited until you'd started believing in the idea of spring, until you'd let yourself think about mud and thaw and the particular smell of ground that's been frozen for 4 months finally releasing, and then it hit you sideways with something worse than anything January had managed. The storm that came on the 14th of March arrived between breakfast and noon. 1 hour the sky was the flat white of a cold but stable day, the kind of day that was at least survivable. By 11 o'clock, the wind had shifted, and by 11:30, the visibility had dropped to the length of the porch and was dropping further. Rhett came in from the east pasture at a run, which she'd never seen him do, and that alone told her the storm was serious. "I need to get the cattle in from the upper range," he said, not stopping, going straight for his heavy coat. "Pete's already out there. Should take us 2 hours, maybe less. And if it takes more," she said, "then we ride fast." He was pulling on his boots. "Owen knows the storm protocol. Stay inside, keep the stove going, don't open the door for any reason." He was out before she could say anything else. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the wind work itself up outside the walls. Then she went to find Owen. He was at his window upstairs, watching the weather with the serious, assessing expression he used for things that concerned him. "Your father's gone for the cattle," she said. "I know." He didn't turn from the window. "He told me this morning it might come fast. He said if it did, we stay in and keep the fire." He paused. "That's what we always do." "All right," she said. She went back downstairs and built the fire up in the main room stove and the kitchen both, then checked the water supply and the lamp oil and did the methodical accounting of a person preparing to wait out something unpleasant. Owen came down after a while and sat at the table and opened his drawing book. Not drawing, just having it in front of him. The wind was loud now, a sustained roar with variations in it, which was somehow worse than a steady sound. An hour passed. Then another. Rhett did not come back. She told herself this was within the range of what he'd said. 2 hours, maybe less, maybe more. She told herself the cattle could be stubborn, that the upper range was genuinely far, that she was measuring time wrong because anxiety made time move strangely. Owen was measuring it too. She could tell from the way he kept his eyes on the drawing book without actually drawing anything. "He's been longer before," he said, in the middle of the second hour, saying it like he was reminding himself. "He has," she agreed. "Once he was gone almost until dark," Owen said. "When 3 of the cattle got through the north fence." "What happened?" "He found them," Owen said. Then, "He always comes back." She looked at the boy across the table, 7 years old, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's careful way of thinking, sitting in a storm he'd survived versions of before, saying the thing he needed to say to manage being scared without showing it. She almost said something about Rhett definitely being fine, about how he knew this land and this weather, about how he'd been working this ranch for years and had gotten through every storm it had thrown at him. But she stopped herself because Owen was not a child who needed reassurance shaped like false certainty. He was a child who needed the truth treated with respect. "He's smart and he knows this land," she said instead. "Those are the things that matter in weather like this." Owen nodded once, slowly. Then he picked up his pencil and started actually drawing. It was in the middle of the 3rd hour that Rhett came back, ice-caked and silent, with Pete behind him, and they brought all the cattle in except for one, a young mare named Calla, who Rhett said had bolted at the storm's first serious gust and run for the tree line at the mountain's base. He set it at the table, warming his hands around a coffee cup, and Evelyn could see from the set of his face that he was already thinking about whether to go back out for the horse. "She'll shelter," Pete said. He was leaning against the kitchen wall, younger than Evelyn had realized, maybe 19, 20. "She's done it before. Smart animal." "Last time she sheltered at the Dennison place," Rhett said. 2 miles in the wrong direction. Cost me 2 days of searching. In this weather, you can't—" "I know that." He looked at the window. "I'm not going tonight." He didn't say, "which means tomorrow, and the weather may be worse tomorrow. And a horse in the mountains in a hard storm was not a simple problem." He didn't say it because he didn't need to. Evelyn heard it anyway, and she suspected Pete did too. Owen had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he was processing something. She noticed it but was watching Rhett, watching the calculation behind his eyes, the particular weight of a man who had too many things to track and was running the inventory. That night the storm did not ease. If anything, it found a second gear. The wind shifted again in the night, and she woke twice to what sounded like the structure of the house under genuine stress, the timbers adjusting. She got up the second time and went to the window and saw nothing except white, the lamp by the gate entirely swallowed. She went back to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the storm and thought about Rhett's face when he'd mentioned the horse, and about the upper range, and about how a 7-year-old boy absorbed the ongoing anxiety of a household that was always one bad season from serious difficulty. She thought about Whitmore's letter in her coat pocket, which she had not answered, which she had not decided how to answer. She was still thinking about it when she fell back asleep. In the morning, the storm had dropped to something manageable, brutal still, but the visibility had returned to 50 yards, then 100. Rhett was up before dawn, which was not unusual, and by the time Evelyn came down, he'd already done the barn and was at the table studying a rough map he'd drawn on the back of an envelope. "The horse," she said. "If she ran for the tree line, she could have gone up the first elk trail before the worst of it hit," he said, without looking up. "There's a hunting shelter about a mile and a half up. Stone foundation, partial roof still. Animals know it." "You're going today?" "Storm's dropped enough." He looked up. "Pete's coming with me. Should be back before dark." Owen was not yet downstairs. She poured herself coffee and looked at the map on the envelope. Just lines, just marks, but she could see the shape of it, the ranch, the fence line, the direction the mountains ran. "I'll stay with Owen," she said. "I know you will." Something in the way he said it, not perfunctory, not managing her, just direct acknowledgement, like it was a fact he'd already organized his thinking around. Did what small things sometimes did, which was to land heavier than expected. She was looking at the map still when she heard Owen on the stairs. He came down moving faster than usual, which meant he'd been awake and had been listening, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway with his coat already on. "I'll come," he said to his father. Rhett looked at him. "I know the elk trail," Owen said. "I've been up it twice. I know where the shelter is." "I know it better than you do," Rhett said, "and it's not a day for children on mountain trails." Owen's jaw tightened in the specific way that meant he was pushing something down, processing it, deciding how to respond. He looked at the map on the table, then he looked at his father. "She's my horse too," he said, quietly, without whining, just a fact. Rhett looked at his son for a long moment. Evelyn looked at neither of them, giving the moment its space. "You'd stay where I put you," Rhett said finally. "You'd do exactly what I told you." "Yes," Owen said. Another long moment. "Go put on your second wool layer," Rhett said. Owen went. Evelyn looked at Rhett. He looked back at her. "He's been on that trail before," he said. "He knows it." "I'm not second-guessing you," she said. "He's your son. I know." He folded the envelope map and put it in his shirt pocket. "But I'm telling you anyway." She understood that. The specific need to have someone witness a decision you were not entirely certain about, not to get their approval, but just to have it seen. "I'll have food ready when you get back," she said. She watched them ride out from the porch. Rhett, Pete, and Owen on the gray mare, bundled into the cold. The storm was still present in the air, more of a heavy mist now than active snow, and the mountains behind the ranch were visible only as a darker mass against the white sky, edges dissolved. She watched until she couldn't see them anymore. She spent the morning working. It was the only thing that helped in situations like this. Not the specific tasks, but the having of them, the way occupation narrowed the available space for anxiety. She worked through the linen closet, which she'd been meaning to organize for weeks. She reorganized the supply box, checked the levels of things, made a list for the next trip to town. She swept the kitchen floor twice, which was once more than it needed, but the rhythm of the broom helped. By noon, the weather had deteriorated. Not back to last night's full violence, but meaningfully worse than the morning. The mist thickened, the wind returned, the sky dropped until the mountains were gone again, and the tree line at the edge of the property was just a dark suggestion. By 2 in the afternoon, Rhett and Owen and Pete had not come back. She made tea and didn't drink it, made food for dinner and left it on the back of the stove where it would stay warm without burning. Stood at the front window and looked at the gate and the fence and the space beyond the fence where the ranch road ran toward the mountain trail and saw nothing. By 3 o'clock, she stopped telling herself they were fine. She went through the supply box methodically. Not for the first time that day, but with a different kind of attention now. Bandages. Carbolic. The small bottle of laudanum she'd kept from the original supplies, replaced with fresh. Her forceps. Her small scissors. She packed what she would take if she needed to go quickly. She told herself she was being prepared, not frightened. The difference was mostly academic. At 3:40, she heard hoofbeats. She was at the door before the sound had fully resolved itself, and what she saw coming through the gate was Pete, alone, on a horse that was blowing hard and had been ridden fast. Her stomach dropped. Pete pulled up at the porch and looked at her, and his face had that particular quality of a young man trying to hold himself together in a situation he was not equipped for. "There was a problem," he said. "Where are they?" "Up near the shelter." He was catching his breath. Owen went ahead, He spotted the horse's tracks going up a secondary path, and he went up to call her back, and the trail gave way under him. Ledge broke. He's not bad hurt, I don't think, but he can't walk, and Rhett can't carry him alone down that kind of terrain. Not in this weather. And there's... He stopped. What? She said. There's someone else at the shelter, Pete said. Already there when they got to it. It's Marshall Holloway. He was riding the mountain for, I don't know, whatever he was doing up there, and he took a fall, and it's bad. He's bad. She was already turning back inside for her coat and her bag. How far? She said. 1.5 miles up, maybe a little more. The trail's passable, barely. Can you take me back up? Yes, he said. That's why I came. She had her bag over her shoulder and her coat on before he'd finished the word. She took one moment to bank the fire properly and left a lamp burning in the window, the instinct of a person who intended to come back and wanted something to come back toward. Then she climbed onto the horse behind Pete, and they went. The trail was not good. The storm had done specific damage to it. Ice in the sheltered parts, a section of the lower switchback that had slid. Nothing catastrophic, but nothing easy either. The horse was steady, and Pete knew how to handle it. But there were moments when the trail felt like a suggestion rather than a fact, and the mountain to one side and empty air to the other were real in a way that kept everything very immediate. She focused on the horse's neck, on her breathing, on the bag in her lap with its specific contents, the weight of it familiar and organizing. They heard Rhett before they saw him, his voice carrying down through the wind. "Pete!" "Here!" Pete called back. Another minute, and they came around a bend and into a small area of relative shelter where the trail widened against a rock face. Rhett was there, and with him was Owen, sitting against the rock with his left leg extended in a way that told her before she'd even dismounted that something was wrong with the ankle or lower leg. He was white around the mouth, but not crying. Of course he wasn't crying. She was off the horse and beside him before Rhett had finished saying her name. "Let me see," she said, and Owen let her look. Let her touch the ankle carefully, watched her face the way people watched her face when she was assessing something, looking for information because her expression would give them what they were trying to figure out about how bad it was. "It's not broken," she said, and felt him breathe. "Badly twisted, possibly a small crack, but I'd need an X-ray to be sure, and we don't have one. Either way, the treatment is the same." She looked at him directly. "It's going to hurt for a while, but you'll be fine." "I know," he said. His voice was steady. 7 years old. She wrapped the ankle with what she had. Not ideal, not what she would have used in a proper setting, but solid and tight and functional. Then she looked up at Rhett. "The marshal," she said. Rhett's face was already telling her it was serious. "Inside," he said, and nodded toward the shelter entrance, a low opening in the rock face mostly covered by the remains of a plank door. She went in. The shelter was exactly what Rhett had described. Stone foundation, partial roof, the smell of old ash from a fire someone had made in it years ago. And in the far corner, sitting against the wall with his back against the stone and his right leg at an angle that was immediately and clearly wrong, was Grant Holloway. He looked at her when she came in. Recognition, and then something she didn't expect. Not the controlled contempt he usually had ready, but something raw, something that pain had opened up where composure usually lived. "Miss Hart," he said. "Marshall." She came across and knelt beside him and started her assessment without ceremony. The leg was the most visible problem, but she'd learned early that the visible problem was not always the most serious one. She checked his pulse, checked his eyes, asked him questions. Where was he going? Had he hit his head? Had he been unconscious? He answered them. His voice was tight with effort but coherent. The leg was broken. She could feel the sight of it through the fabric of his trousers without pressing hard enough to make it worse. A bad break, mid-shaft femur, the kind that bled into the surrounding tissue and could, if left unaddressed long enough, become genuinely dangerous. There was also a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled significantly and dried. He'd been there, alone, for somewhere between 2 and 4 hours. She reached into her bag. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I need you to understand what I'm doing and why." "What are you doing?" he said. "Stabilizing the fracture so you can be moved. If we try to carry you without stabilizing it, the movement makes everything worse." He was looking at her. His jaw was tight. She could see him managing the pain. managing it the way people managed it when they'd been managing it alone for a while. The internal structure of it visible in his face, the scaffolding. Use whatever you have, he said. She used 2 pieces of wood from the collapsed section of the shelter's frame and the strips she cut from the bottom of her own petticoat. Not elegant, not what she'd have chosen, but rigid enough to matter and long enough to span the break site on both sides. She worked as quickly as she could without compromising the result. Holloway made sounds a couple of times, not words, just sounds, the involuntary sounds that came when pain got past the managing. And she kept talking, not to distract him but to inform him, telling him what she was doing at each step. Because people managed pain better when they weren't waiting for something unknown. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was sweating despite the cold. His face was the color of old wax, but he was looking at her. "You could have left," he said. She knew immediately what he meant. "Don't," she said. Not angry, just don't. "I mean it," he said. His voice was rougher now, the pain having done something to the edges of it. "I know what I've said about you in this town. You didn't have any reason to—" "You're hurt and you're on a mountain in a storm," she said. "That's the reason." She began cleaning the cut above his eye, which needed attention and was easier to address than what he was trying to say. There's no other calculus involved. He was quiet for a moment. She worked on the cut. "I was told things," he said finally, "about what happened in Abilene." "I know what you were told. Whitmore was a county board member when I lived in Kansas," he said. 12 years ago. I knew him. Not well, but I knew him." She stopped what she was doing, looked at him. "He reached out to me before you arrived here," Holloway continued. His eyes were very direct, the pain not allowing him to hide in them the way people sometimes did. "Asked me to keep an eye out. Said you'd caused significant trouble in his practice. Said you'd fabricated accusations against him to cover your own misconduct." The shelter was very quiet except for the wind outside. "And you believed him," she said. "I had no reason not to. Did you ask anyone else? Did you try to verify it?" A pause. "No." She looked at him for another moment. Then she went back to the cut above his eye. "The medication records I kept," she said, "exist. I still have copies. Whitmore administered incorrect doses of digitalis to 3 elderly patients over a period of 8 months. One of them died, but the death was attributed to age, not medication. The other 2 recovered without knowing how close they came to not recovering." She finished with the cut. "That's what I reported. That's what I lost my position over, and I would do it again." Holloway said nothing for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Rhett's voice, and Pete's, and once Owen's, planning the descent, working out the logistics of getting 2 injured people down a compromised trail in bad weather. "Why are you telling me that?" Holloway said. "Because you asked," she said. "And because whatever you decide to do with it is your business. I'm not telling you to change your mind about me. I'm telling you because it's the truth and you're a lawman, and the truth seems like it ought to matter to a lawman, even in a situation like this." She looked at him directly. "But it doesn't change anything about what we need to do right now," she said. "Can you put weight on the other leg at all?" He tested it. "Yes." "Then here's how we're going to do this." Getting Holloway down the mountain was the hardest physical thing Evelyn had done in her adult life. Rhett and Pete worked out a system using rope from Rhett's saddlebag and 2 thick branches Pete cut, improvised and ungainly, not designed for this, but functional enough to take most of Holloway's weight off the broken leg. Rhett took the forward position, Pete the back, and Evelyn moved alongside, watching the leg, watching Holloway's color, telling them when to stop and when to go slower. Owen rode the horse at the rear, the horse led on a line by Pete's free hand, Owen's wrapped ankle keeping him from walking, but not from sitting a saddle. The wind was the ongoing problem. Not violent enough to stop them, but consistent enough to make every step uncertain, the trail icy in the shadowed parts, loose in the exposed parts, never quite reliable under the foot. They did not talk much. There wasn't the energy for it. She watched Holloway's face through the descent. He was conscious and intending to stay that way. She could see the active decision in him, the choice he was making with each segment of the trail, not to give in to the shock that was sitting at the edges of him. She talked to him at intervals, questions designed to keep him present. What was the weather like when he'd started up? How long had he been coming out to this part of the territory? Details that required his mind to stay working. He answered, every time. It took them an hour and 40 minutes to reach the base of the trail. When they came out onto the flat ground near the ranch fence, the light was going, the sun dropped early and fast in March, the way it did, and the storm had settled into a steady driving snow that was miserable but not dangerous, the kind of weather you could manage if you kept moving. Pete rode ahead to get the wagon. Evelyn sat on the cold ground beside Holloway, because sitting seemed better than standing for both of them right now, and Rhett sat on the other side of him, and Owen was still on the horse nearby, watching all of it with those serious dark eyes. Holloway looked at Evelyn. Something in his face had been reorganizing itself during the descent, some internal accounting being done that showed around the edges. I owe you an apology, he said. Rough, not easy, not the smooth delivery of a man who apologized often. I know that doesn't fix what I've had a hand in this town. She looked at the fence line, the snow coming down. No, she said. It doesn't. She paused. But it's a start. Holloway looked at the ground. Rhett said nothing. But she felt the warmth of him there, the solidity of him on the other side of this battered lawman who had helped make her life in Silver Creek harder than it had to be, and she felt something that had been wound tight in her for weeks loosen, fractionally, one increment. It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't there yet. She didn't know if she would be. But it was the beginning of something, maybe. Or the end of something. Sometimes those were hard to tell apart. Pete came back with the wagon. They loaded Holloway as carefully as 4 people could, and then Owen climbed down from the horse, and Evelyn helped him into the wagon bed where he could keep his ankle elevated, and he sat beside the marshal with the slightly self-conscious dignity of a 7-year-old who has been through something serious and is not entirely sure yet what it means. Rhett drove. Evelyn sat in the wagon bed, monitoring both patients, watching Holloway's breathing and Owen's color and the road ahead. The lights of Silver Creek appeared in the dark an hour later. She watched them as they approached. The lit windows, the lamps on the main street, all that warm yellow light that had been closed off to her when she first arrived. The town that had organized itself against her, that had whispered and calculated and decided. She was about to bring them their marshal, alive, because she'd gone up a mountain in a storm and done what she knew how to do. She didn't feel triumphant about it. It wasn't like that. Not clean, not simple. She just felt tired and cold and very present in the specific reality of the moment. The wagon moving over frozen ground, the boy beside her breathing steadily, the man across from her alive when the alternative had been possible. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. They brought Holloway into Silver Creek on a Wednesday night, and by Thursday morning the whole town knew what had happened on that mountain. That was the thing about small towns. The same machinery that spread rumors spread truth with equal efficiency. It didn't discriminate between what it carried, just moved things fast, the way water moved through whatever channels were available. Pete had talked, which was expected. The livery stable hand who'd helped them get Holloway into Doc Morrison's care had talked. Doc Morrison himself had been uncharacteristically forthcoming when Tom Birch stopped by the next morning, which was less expected but perhaps reflected something about what he'd seen when Evelyn had handed Holloway over, the stabilized fracture, the controlled bleeding, the clean work of it. Evelyn had not talked. She'd done what she came to do, made sure Holloway was properly transferred to Morrison's care, made sure Owen's ankle was properly wrapped, and that Rhett understood the care instructions, and then she'd gone back to the ranch and slept for 10 hours and woken up feeling like she'd been dragged behind a horse. She was at the kitchen table with coffee when Rhett came back from his morning rounds and told her what was circulating in town. "They're saying you saved him," he said. "Pete and Rhett saved him," she said. "I just made sure he survived the trip down. That's not a small thing." "No," she agreed, "but it's also not a miracle. It's what anyone with basic training would have done." Rhett sat down across from her. He had that look he got sometimes, like he was working out how to say something he'd been turning over for a while. "Holloway is talking," he said. She looked up. "Morrison told me this morning. Holloway's been telling people what happened up there, not just the rescue. What he told you about Whitmore reaching out to him before you arrived." Rhett set his hands flat on the table. "About how he was asked to manage your reception here." The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. "He didn't have to do that," she said. No, Red agreed. He didn't. She thought about Holloway on the mountain, his face that particular wax-pale color, saying, "I owe you an apology in a voice that meant it cost him." Men like Holloway, men who'd built their authority on certainty, on the reputation of never being wrong, didn't offer that kind of thing easily, and they especially didn't continue offering it once they were safely in a warm room with a doctor and the immediate crisis had passed. The easy thing would have been to let the story be about the rescue and leave the rest of it quietly in the mountain shelter where it had been said. He hadn't done that. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it under things she'd think about later, which was a file that had been accumulating for months. "How's Owen's ankle?" she said. "Sore. He's pretending it isn't. Tell him to keep it elevated today. He can do his reading propped up in bed." "That's not a punishment, that's just sense." Rhett almost smiled. "I'll tell him you said so. He'll listen to you faster than he'll listen to me." "He listens to you fine." "He listens to me because he has to," Rhett said. "He listens to you because he wants to. Different thing." She didn't have an answer for that, so she got up and refilled her coffee. The first concrete change happened 2 days later, on a Saturday. She was coming out of Birch's general store. She'd started going in alone, without Rhett, partly because she needed to handle her own affairs, and partly because she refused to behave like someone who needed an escort to buy thread. When Margaret Cassidy stepped off the hotel porch and directly into her path, Evelyn stopped. Margaret Cassidy looked older than she had in January, somehow. Not physically older, but with the quality of a person who has been carrying something heavier than usual, and it was showing in how she stood. Her chin was not quite at the angle she normally held it. Her hands were at her sides, and she was doing something with them, pressing her thumb against her forefinger repeatedly. "Miss Hart," she said. "Mrs. Cassidy." A long pause. Long enough that Evelyn started calculating the path around her. "I heard what happened on the mountain," Margaret Cassidy said. Her voice was not quite at its usual volume. Not quiet exactly, but lower. "With the marshal and the boy." "Owen's going to be fine," Evelyn said. "His ankle." "I know about the ankle." She stopped, started again. "I'm talking about what you did. For Holloway." Evelyn waited. "I may have—" Another stop. Margaret Cassidy was not a woman who did this, who halted and restarted, who showed the working. "I may have said things, in the early weeks, about your character, that I took on faith when I shouldn't have." It was not an apology. It was as close to one as Margaret Cassidy was capable of producing in a public street in broad daylight, which Evelyn suspected was as much as she was going to get. "I appreciate you saying that," Evelyn said carefully. "I'm not asking you to—" Margaret stopped again, pressed her lips together. "I'm not asking anything. I just needed to say it." She turned and went back into the hotel. Evelyn stood on the boardwalk for a moment. The cold air moved past her. 2 men on the other side of the street had observed the exchange. She could see them not looking with the specific energy of people who had definitely been looking. She went on toward the horse. Clara Pruitt was harder and more surprising, and happened a week later. Evelyn was at the Marsh homestead. Addie had asked her to come look at Lucy, who had what turned out to be a mild ear infection, the kind that needed monitoring but not yet intervention, when she heard hoofbeats and looked out the window and saw Clara Pruitt's wagon on the road outside. Clara did not stop. She slowed, and she looked at the homestead, and her eyes found Evelyn in the window with the specific accuracy of a woman who had known where to look. She stopped the wagon. Evelyn came outside. They stood 10 feet apart in the cold. Addie had come to the door but stayed in the doorframe, reading the situation. "I heard about the mountain," Clara said. She was a rigid woman, always, but rigidity in a person was sometimes the structure holding things together when other things were falling apart, and right now she had the look of someone whose structure was under strain. "I heard the whole of it, what Holloway said about Whitmore." "What Holloway said doesn't change anything that happened to me here," Evelyn said. "Not hostile, just true." Clara's jaw moved once. "No," she said. "I know it doesn't. You closed your door in my face in a snowstorm." "I know what I did." They looked at each other. "My husband lost money," Clara said abruptly, like something coming loose. "Years ago. To a man from the East who had good references and a good story and turned out to be neither. When you came here with your reputation from back East—" She stopped. It wasn't only about you. I know that's not an excuse. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the hotel lobby in January, the 2-inch open door at the boarding house, the 5 places she'd been refused in one afternoon in a blizzard. It's not an excuse, she said, but it's a reason. Those are different things. Clara Pruitt nodded stiffly. She gathered her reins. I have a room that's empty, she said. If you know anyone who needs a place. She paused. Or if you ever need space for seeing patients, a proper room with a door that closes. She drove on before Evelyn could respond. Addie appeared at Evelyn's elbow. That's the closest Clara Pruitt has come to an apology since 1879, Addie said. I was there for that one too. It also involved a lot of not quite saying the thing. Evelyn let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Is she always like that? Always, Addie confirmed. But she means it, for what it's worth. She means things. She just can't get them out. The town's recalibration was not clean or linear. That was important. It wasn't a sudden conversion, wasn't a wave of contrition that swept through Silver Creek and set everything right. It was more like a slow, uneven thaw, the kind where some days feel like spring and then it freezes again overnight and you're back to ice in the morning. Some people came around with what looked like genuine self-examination. Tom Birch stopped holding the list at arm's length and started filling her orders with something approaching the normal speed. Ruth Colton's husband, a taciturn man named Edgar, who'd viewed Evelyn with open skepticism, stopped at the ranch on a Saturday with a haunch of venison and said he'd heard about Owen and the mountain and he hoped the boy's ankle was healing right, and he did not quite meet her eyes, but he stayed long enough to drink a coffee, which was something. Others adjusted their posture without adjusting anything deeper. They were civil in the way people were civil when they'd been caught out and were managing their exposure, and she recognized the difference. She didn't hold it against them exactly, she just noted it, and some didn't move at all. Reverend Blaine passed her on the street 2 weeks after the mountain and looked at her the same way he always had, that performed patience, that deliberate non-acknowledgement, and kept walking. She thought about calling after him, but didn't, because there was a specific kind of person who moved on principle rather than evidence, and no amount of evidence was going to get past the principle, and knowing that was its own kind of freedom. Holloway was at Morrison's for 3 weeks with the broken leg. She went to see him once, not because she felt obligated, but because she needed to have a specific conversation and she wanted to have it face to face. He was propped up in bed with a copy of the Territorial Law Bulletin open on his knees, looking like a man conducting business from an undignified position, which was probably how he experienced most of the 3 weeks. He looked up when she came in. Something arranged itself differently in his face. Miss Hart. Marshall. She sat in the chair beside the bed. How's the leg? Morrison says 6 weeks before I'm on it properly. I say 4. Morrison's right. Probably. He set the bulletin down. He had the quality today of a man who had been doing thinking, the settled kind of thinking that had worked itself through to some conclusion. I wrote to the Territorial Medical Board, he said, about Whitmore, about the records you said you have. She looked at him. I have contacts there, he said. Not Whitmore's kind of contacts, different ones. I told them what I knew, what you told me on the mountain and what I know independently about Whitmore's time in Kansas, about a patient complaint I was aware of and chose not to pursue at the time because Whitmore asked me not to, and I considered him a credible man. His jaw tightened at that. I'm not sure what they'll do with it, but they'll have it. Evelyn sat with this for a moment. You didn't have to do that, she said. Second time she'd said those words about him. They meant something different this time. I had information that was relevant to an ongoing situation, he said. That's basic law. It's more than basic law, and you know it. He looked at the window. I was used, he said quietly, by Whitmore, to do his work for him in a place he didn't want to get his hands dirty. I don't like being used. Is that the only reason? A pause. No, he said. It's not. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. Some things didn't need to be spelled out. She stood to go. Miss Hart. She turned. Holloway was looking at her directly, the way he'd looked at her on the mountain. No bureaucratic distance, just the direct look of one person at another. What you did up there, whatever I've said or done in this town, you knew all of it, and you still... He stopped. That's a particular kind of character. I want you to know I recognize it. She looked at him for a moment. Get well, Marshall, she said, and left. Walking out into the March air, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not the uncomplicated satisfaction of being vindicated, which was what she'd imagined she might feel if this moment ever came. Instead, she felt something more layered, a tiredness that was not entirely unpleasant, the tiredness of someone who has been carrying something uphill for a long time and has finally reached a place where the gradient eases. And underneath that, a more complicated grief. For the months she'd spent being small in the face of this town's judgment, for the specific damage that did, the way it made you doubt your own perceptions, your own worth, your own right to be somewhere. That didn't get healed by Holloway writing a letter or Margaret Cassidy almost apologizing on a boardwalk. It was its own injury, and it would take its own time. She rode back to the ranch. Owen was on the porch when she arrived, ankle propped on a stool Rhett had set out for him, drawing book open in his lap. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the front of the house, catching the weathered wood at an angle that made it look almost golden, though she knew it was just old timber in afternoon sun. How's the Marshall? Owen asked. Improving, she tied off the horse. How's the ankle? Fine. That means it hurts. He looked at her. It's fine, he said again, with more dignity. She sat on the porch step below him. He went back to his drawing. After a moment, she looked at what he was drawing. The shelter, she realized. The mountain shelter, rendered in his careful, slightly imprecise hand, with 4 small figures outside it. Are you drawing the rescue? She said. I'm drawing what happened, he said. So I remember it right. He tilted the book slightly toward her. That one's you. I made you taller than you are. I couldn't get it right. She looked at the small figure he'd indicated. It was taller than the others, slightly, and had long hair and was standing next to the shelter entrance. You made me look determined, she said. Owen considered the drawing. You were, he said simply. She looked at the drawing for another moment, and then at the boy, who was already going back to adding detail. The rock face behind the shelter, the suggestion of snow, the horse at the edge of the image. Rhett came out of the barn with feed buckets, saw them on the porch, left the buckets by the barn door, and came over. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the drawing Owen was working on, then at Evelyn. Tom Birch asked about you today, he said. In what sense? She said. The useful sense. He's heard from 2 more women in the last week who wanted to know if the woman at Callahan's could come look at something. He thinks there might be value in having a medical person closer to town. He paused. His words, not mine. Tom Birch was barely filling my orders 6 weeks ago. I know that, Rhett said. I'm not saying this to be difficult. I'm saying I don't entirely trust a change that moves this fast. He considered this. Fair, he said, but fast change and real change aren't the same thing. Sometimes fast is just the surface moving to catch up with something that already shifted underneath. Owen looked up from his drawing. Like ice breaking up in spring, he said. It looks like it happens all at once, but it's been melting for a long time. Both adults looked at him. It's what Pa said, Owen said, with the pragmatic honesty of a child who doesn't see why that should be remarkable. Evelyn looked at Rhett. He had the expression he sometimes had. Not smiling exactly, but the terrain of his face doing something that suggested smiling was not far off. Smart kid, she said. He has his moments, Rhett said. She turned back to the yard, to the late afternoon light on the fence and the barn and the mountains beyond. Still snow-capped, still enormous, still the kind of landscape that didn't care much about any individual human story happening at its base. But this story was happening anyway. It was accumulating day by day in the way real things accumulated. Not clean, not finished. Owen's ankle still hurt, and Holloway's letter to the medical board was a gesture, not a resolution, and Whitmore was still out there, and Reverend Blaine would still look through her on the street tomorrow. Yet something had genuinely moved. She could feel it in the way the town no longer closed in the same formation when she walked through it, in the way Addie Marsh had started telling her neighbors about Lucy's ear, casually, in the same tone she'd use for any useful piece of information, in the way Clara Pruitt had offered a room. She still didn't know what she was building here, or whether it would hold. The ground felt less certain than she'd like. But then again, it had never been certain. She'd just been pretending, in her worst moments, that certainty was something she could have lost, when really she'd never had it to begin with. No one did. That, she was slowly learning, did not have to be the terrifying thing she'd always made it. April came without announcement. One morning the ground was still iron hard, and the next there was mud at the barn door, and that was how spring arrived in Montana. Not as an event, but as a gradual loosening, the world releasing its grip on itself by degrees. The snow on the lower slopes pulled back up toward the peaks. The creek at the north edge of the property, which had been silent under ice for 4 months, started making sound again. Small sounds at first, then more confident ones, until by mid-April it was running proper, and you could hear it from the porch on a still morning. Evelyn noticed all of it, which was new. She had not been a person who noticed seasons before. In Abilene, there had been too much going on inside the office and inside her own head to pay attention to what the world was doing outside the window. Here, you noticed because the land was too large to ignore and because the people around her were tied to it in ways that made it matter. Owen tracked the snow line on the mountains with the same seriousness he tracked everything. Rhett watched the pasture grass the way other men watched financial figures, because for him, it was financial figures. She was becoming someone who tracked those things too. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. Owen's ankle had healed correctly. No crack after all, just ligament damage, stubborn and slow, but clean. By early April, he was walking on it without favoring it, and by mid-April, he'd made it back to his climbing tree at the edge of the yard, which she understood was a significant benchmark. She watched him from the porch one afternoon making his careful way up to the branch he'd been working toward since fall, and when he reached it and sat with his legs dangling and looked down at her with that carefully contained satisfaction, she made herself just nod, which was what the moment called for. Not a production, just acknowledgement. He nodded back and looked out at the view from the branch, which was the whole point. Things in town had continued their uneven evolution. Holloway was back on his feet in 4 weeks, not 6, which she suspected had less to do with his constitution and more to do with his stubbornness. He'd resumed his official duties with the same deliberate manner he did everything, and if people noticed that he greeted Evelyn with a civil nod when they passed on the street, rather than the studied distance of before, nobody said anything directly. Nobody needed to. Silver Creek was a town that processed information through observation. The letter from the Territorial Medical Board came in the 3rd week of April. She was at the kitchen table when Rhett brought it in from the supply run, and she recognized the return address and sat with it in her hands for a moment before opening it. The board had reviewed Whitmore's licensing record. They had received Holloway's correspondence and cross-referenced it with a complaint that had apparently been filed and suppressed by the family of the patient who had died 3 years ago in Abilene. An investigation had been opened. The letter did not promise outcomes, but it listed specific actions taken and asked if she would be willing to provide the documentation she held. She read it twice. Then she put it down on the table. Rhett was watching her from across the kitchen. "Good news?" he said. "Complicated news," she said. "Good complicated." She pushed the letter across to him. He read it in the same thorough way he read everything. She got up and made coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. "You'll send the records," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've been carrying copies since I left Abilene," she said. 14 months, in the bottom of that suitcase." She gestured toward the room upstairs where the worn suitcase sat at the foot of the bed, where it had sat since January. "I didn't know what I was saving them for. I just couldn't throw them away." Rhett set the letter down. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was thinking something through. "You knew this day might come," he said. "I hoped it might," she said. Hoping and knowing are different." "You kept the evidence anyway." "Yes." "That took a specific kind of—" He paused, not reaching for the grand word, settling for the accurate one. "Persistence." She poured the coffee, set his cup in front of him, sat back down. "It took stubbornness," she said. "I was angry. Anger is good for keeping things." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll remember that." She wrote back to the medical board that week and sent the documents with the following Tuesday's stage. 14 months of carrying them, and they were gone in an envelope in under 20 minutes. She stood at the stage stop and watched the driver load the mail pouch and felt something she couldn't entirely categorize. Not relief, not triumph. More like the specific lightness of a person who has set down something they didn't realize how heavy it was until the weight was gone. It was Tom Birch who first raised the idea of a clinic, which was not who she would have predicted. He came to the ranch on a Thursday morning in late April, which was itself unusual. Tom Birch was a town person, the kind of person who thought of 6 miles as a significant distance. He pulled up in his wagon, looking like someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say and then lost the script on the way over. Rhett was out on the east pasture. Evelyn came off the porch to meet him. "Miss Hart," he said, "I hope I'm not... I should have sent word first." "What can I do for you, Mr. Birch?" He turned his hat in his hands. "I've been talking with some folks in town," he said. "Merchants, some of the ranch families. There's a feeling that the territory could use a medical person closer in than Billings." He paused. "What you did this winter, with Holloway, and with the Colton child and Addie's girl, with Owen? People have noticed." "People noticed me in January too," she said. "They noticed differently." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I know that," he said. "I know I wasn't..." He stopped. "I didn't treat you right when you came here. I want to be direct about that." She waited. "I'm here because I think there's something practical that could be built," he said, pulling himself back to the prepared ground of practical matters, which was clearly where he was more comfortable. "A proper space for medical work. There's a building next to the post office that's been empty since the Danforth family left. Good bones, sound roof. It would need fitting out, but the space is there." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "And the town council would support this," she said. "I've spoken to 4 of the 5 members," he said. 3 are in favor. The 4th is Reverend Blaine, who..." He stopped diplomatically. "Who is consistently himself," she said. "Yes," Tom Birch said with what she thought might have been relief at not having to say it more plainly. "But 3 out of 5 is a majority." She thanked him for coming out. She told him she would think about it. She told him nothing else because she genuinely needed to think about it, and she'd learned not to let the pressure of a moment make decisions for her that she'd have to live inside for a long time. She told Rhett that evening. He was at the kitchen table with the account book, which was his evening ritual when the accounts needed attention and his evening avoidance ritual when they didn't. Tonight, from the look of the numbers on the page, it was somewhere in between. She told him about Birch, the building, the council vote. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she'd come to value. He listened to the whole thing before he responded, didn't jump in at the first pause with what he was already thinking. When she finished, he closed the account book. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Part of me thinks I should take it. There are people in this territory who need access to medical care and don't have it. That's a real thing, and I can address it. And the other part?" She was quiet for a moment. "The other part doesn't entirely trust it," she said. "The town had an opinion about me 4 months ago. Now circumstances have shifted and they have a different opinion. What happens when circumstances shift again?" Rhett looked at the table. "That's a fair concern," he said. "But?" She heard it in his voice. "Not a but," he said. "Just, people change and they don't change at the same time. The town was wrong about you, and some of them know that now, and knowing it means something even if it doesn't mean everything." He paused. "And you being here, doing the work, that's what creates a different kind of knowing, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances." She looked at him across the table. "You should have been a lawyer," she said. "Too much talking indoors," he said. She went to bed without deciding. She lay in the dark and listened to the creak sound that was new to April, and thought about the building next to the post office, and the Territorial Medical Board's letter, and the records she'd mailed to Billings, and the long unbroken chain of things that had started on a stagecoach in a storm in January. She thought about what it would mean to make a decision that pointed forward instead of one that was just surviving the present. She hadn't made very many of those in the last 14 months. She hadn't felt entitled to. She fell asleep still thinking about it, and in the morning she knew what she was going to do. What she did not know, and what changed everything in the week that followed, was what Rhett had been doing in the meantime. She found out on a Tuesday morning when he asked her to walk with him to the east side of the property on the pretext of looking at a fence section that needed repair. She went because fence repair was a reasonable thing to need a second person for, and because she had no reason to suspect the fence was not the actual destination. The fence was fine. What was on the east side of the property, set back from the fence line against a stand of cottonwood trees, was a structure she hadn't seen before. It was small, one room perhaps, maybe two, and it wasn't finished, but the framing was up and the roof was on and the walls were partially sided, and it was clearly and unmistakably a building someone had been constructing with intention. She stopped. Rhett stopped beside her. She looked at the building, looked at him. He was watching her with a careful expression, not the closed, uninflected face he used in public, but the more open one he used here at the ranch, when it was just them. "How long?" she said. "Started in February," he said. "After the letter from Whitmore's lawyer. I figured," he paused, choosing words with the deliberateness of a man who wanted to get it right. "I figured you needed to know there was something here that was yours, not mine, not conditional. Yours." She looked at the building. The framing was good work. She could see that even without knowing much about construction, the way it was squared and solid, the roof already doing its job. He'd put proper time into it, weeks of time, in the morning hours before she was up, or in the long winter evenings when she'd thought he was simply managing the account book. "You built this without telling me," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd stay," he said. Simply, not an accusation, just the truth. "And I didn't want to. I didn't want you to feel like I was making a claim on what you decided. I wanted you to have the thing, and then decide." She turned to look at him. There was something in his face that he was not quite managing to contain, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would be obvious to someone who didn't know him, but she knew him, and she could see the specific vulnerability of a man who has done something significant and is now waiting to find out if he's read the situation correctly. "Rhett," she said. "It's not finished," he said quickly, which she recognized as him retreating into the practical details when the other thing got too exposed. "The interior needs work, the floor, the shelving. You'd want specific shelving for medical supplies. I didn't know the measurements. And there's a window on the south side that I need to refit because it's not hanging right." "Rhett." He stopped talking. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about January, the 5 words he'd said in the snow outside the church hall, the clean sheets on the bed she hadn't expected, the way he'd listened to her tell him about Whitmore without calculating what it was worth to him. She thought about Owen's drawing of 2 figures in the ranch yard, about the morning routine in the barn she'd learned because he'd shown her, about the letter from the medical board sitting resolved in her coat pocket, instead of the one from Whitmore's lawyer that had sat there unresolved all winter. She thought about the fact that she had woken up this morning in a house and known where everything was, known the sounds of it, known who would be awake before her and what the coffee would taste like, and what the mountain light did to the kitchen window at that hour. She had known all of that the way you know things that have become yours without you noticing. "It's a good building," she said. He let out a breath, small, controlled, but she heard it. "The window on the south side is an easy fix," she said. "I can help with the shelving. I know what measurements I'd need." She paused. "And I talked to Birch yesterday. I'm going to decline the building next to the post office." Rhett looked at her. "If I'm going to do this work," she said, "I want to do it from here. From this property." She looked at the building again. The solid framing, the roof doing its job. "It's a better location anyway, closer to the ranch families who actually need it." "That's a practical argument," he said. "I'm a practical person." "You are," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Evelyn." She looked at him. He was doing the thing he did when he was about to say something he'd been working up to. That small internal adjustment, the settling of something. "I know this isn't what you planned when you got off that stage," he said. "I know this place, these people. None of this was what you were heading toward." He looked at the building, then back at her. "But I want you to know that whatever you decide about what you want this to be, what we are, what this place is, I'm not going to change my mind about you being here. That's not dependent on anything." It was not a declaration in the romantic sense, not speeches, not grand gestures. It was something more essential than that. It was a man who had watched the world be careless with someone and was telling her plainly that he intended to be the opposite. She had spent 14 months preparing to leave places before they could make her go. It had become so automatic she'd almost packed her suitcase back in February before she'd caught herself. The instinct was still there. The old wiring of a person who'd learned that belonging was always temporary, that the comfortable thing was to prepare for its end before it arrived. But the thing about old wiring was that it could be replaced. Slowly, with intention, with enough time and enough evidence. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way ice melted, the way Owen said, like it happened suddenly, but it's been changing for a long time. I know, she said. I know you won't. They walked back to the house. Owen was on the porch with his drawing book, working on something she couldn't see from the yard. He looked up when they came through the gate. Is the fence bad? He said. Fence is fine, Rhett said. Owen looked between them. Children that age were not as unobservant as adults liked to believe. He looked back down at his drawing. I made breakfast, he said. There's biscuits. Evelyn looked at the boy. He'd made biscuits the way she made them, with the method she'd shown him 3 weeks ago when he'd asked to learn, standing on a stool at the kitchen counter with his tongue between his teeth, concentrating. She hadn't asked him to make them this morning. He'd just done it. Thank you, Owen, she said. He nodded without looking up, turned his drawing book toward her briefly. It was the clinic building, the new one, on the east side of the property. He'd drawn it finished, with a door and windows and a small sign she couldn't read the words on. I saw Pa building it, he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. I've been drawing it finished so we know what it's supposed to look like. He considered the drawing. The sign says Heart Medical, he added. Entirely matter-of-fact the way he delivered all information. I decided. She looked at the drawing, then at the boy, then at the man standing beside her, who had the expression of someone trying hard not to show that the moment had gotten to him. She sat down on the porch step below Owen's chair the way she'd sat many mornings before, in the cold and the thin spring light, and the ranch made its ordinary sounds around them. The horses in the paddock, the creek at the north edge, a bird beginning the argument of its morning somewhere in the cottonwoods. This was the thing nobody told you about belonging. It didn't arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a collection of ordinary details that suddenly added up to something you recognized. A boy making biscuits without being asked. A building with your name on a sign in a 7-year-old's handwriting. A man who built things in the early morning dark because he wanted you to have something that was yours. It wasn't perfect. The town was still complicated and Whitmore was still out there, and Rhett had a broken window on the south side of the clinic that needed fixing, and she still woke up some mornings with the old reflex, the checking, the preparing to leave, the rehearsal of departure. That would take longer to undo. But here was what she'd learned, at the end of a Montana winter that had tried to consume her. Courage was not the absence of the reflex. It was the decision made in spite of it. It was staying when every old instinct said to go. It was letting a 7-year-old put your name on a sign. It was trusting that the floor would hold even when you couldn't see what it was built on. She had arrived in Silver Creek with one suitcase and a reputation that wasn't hers. She was still here. The suitcase was upstairs at the foot of the bed, empty. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the whole of it. Everything she'd been moving toward since January without knowing the destination. Not vindication, not triumph, not the town finally seeing her correctly, though those things had mattered and still did. Just this. A place she was no longer preparing to leave. A life she was living instead of defending. The sun came up over the mountains and did what April sun did. Moved the light across the yard slowly, reaching the fence post first, then the barn, then the porch, where 3 people sat with biscuits and the quiet morning sounds of a ranch coming back to life after winter. Evelyn Hart drank her coffee. She was home,